My wife lost everything. Every penny, every inch of land, every memory we built together, destroyed by betrayal. I found out. It was inevitable. For months, I felt something out of place, little signs that, at first, I tried to ignore. The absence of long kisses, the conversations that became superficial and, finally, the whispers on the phone when she thought I wasn't around. Betrayal has a bitter smell, a constant presence that infiltrates every detail of everyday life until there is nothing left but distrust and hurt. It wasn't just the fact that she betrayed me, it was the way she did it, planned, careful, as if everything had been a game for her. How can someone share a life, a house, dreams, and at the same time weave such an elaborate web of lies? I didn't know. In fact, I don't think I wanted to know. For a long time, I clung to the hope that this would be temporary, that the warmth between us would return, that the laughter we shared would one day return. But her every smile was a fake, and I found that out the hard way. I remember that night, when everything exploded in front of me. I went home early, with plans for a surprise, but I was the one who received the surprise. A bitter surprise. I knew there was something wrong. The signs were there, hidden, but clear enough that I could no longer ignore them. At first I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, that it was my head playing tricks. But the truth was naked and raw in front of me, impossible to deny. My world turned upside down when I saw them together. In my bed. Our sanctuary. The place that was just ours. At that moment, I felt my blood run cold. Time stopped. The betrayal wasn't just physical, it was emotional, mental. She had shared what was ours with another man. I couldn't breathe. Every piece of my heart was crushed in that moment, and the only thing that kept me standing was anger. An anger that burned so deep it almost consumed me. I wanted to scream, to cry, but I kept quiet, watching. The betrayal ate at me inside, and I knew nothing would ever be the same. Revenge, they say, is a dish best served cold, and that's exactly how I served it. Coldly, with calculation. She didn't realize what was coming. And I made a point of being meticulous, of removing everything. Absolutely everything. The divorce was quick, painful, but necessary. There would be nothing left for her, no home, no money, no dignity. She wanted to play with fire, so I let it burn until everything she knew turned to ashes. But it wasn't just me who abandoned her. Him too. The man she chose, the lover with whom she shared what was mine, disappeared as soon as the cards were laid on the table. He didn't want to hear about her without the luxuries I provided her, without the shine of a comfortable life. He abandoned her the same way she betrayed me, leaving her alone, empty, with nothing but regret and shame. Was this the ending she expected? Certainly not. But for some reason it didn't bring me peace. Even seeing her lose everything, even knowing that she now suffered the consequences of her choices, there was still something there, something that bothered me, something I couldn't identify. What else could be hidden behind this betrayal? Was there something she didn't tell me? Something I missed? Welcome to our channel. Here, we do not support, under any circumstances, treason. The stories you will hear are fiction, but the truth behind them is clear. Betrayal destroys lives, corrodes relationships and leaves deep scars. Get ready to dive into a shocking story, where choices have consequences. Enjoy, and remember, loyalty is always the best path. Good story. The rain fell incessantly that night, creating an almost hypnotic rhythm against the windows of the luxurious apartment where Ethan and Isabel lived. The sound of the water mixed with the profound silence of the living room, where the couple used to spend their evenings together, surrounded by the comfortable routine of years of marriage. Ethan was a successful man, someone who, at first glance, had everything that many wanted, a stable career in the financial market, considerable assets and a wife who had always been seen as the pillar of his life. Isabel, in turn, was the picture of sophistication. Polite, elegant, with a subtle intelligence that attracted attention in any room she entered. She had always known how to be the center of attention without seeming forced, maintaining an aura of serenity that contrasted with the competitive and cutthroat environment in which her husband worked. In the eyes of their friends, they were the perfect couple, the model of success and happiness, an image carefully honed over the years. However, like many things that seem unshakable, what happened behind the doors of that apartment was much more complex. Ethan, despite all his outward success, had begun to feel empty. An emotional hole that he couldn't fully understand, but which manifested itself in a slight dissatisfaction that permeated his days. In recent months, he had become more introspective, oscillating between long hours at the office and nights when, even at home, he seemed not to be there. He loved Isabel, there was no doubt about that. But at the same time, an imperceptible distance began to form between the two. It was something subtle, almost invisible, like a small thread pulled from a perfect weave. For Isabel, this change in Ethan's behavior did not go unnoticed. She was also changed. Although she never spoke about it, she felt that her life as the wife and companion of a businessman had consumed parts of her that she barely recognized. The routine, once comforting, now seemed suffocating. Isabel, who had always been a dynamic and lively woman, began to feel trapped. It wasn't something she said out loud, in fact, it was something she didn't even admit to herself. But in quiet moments, when she was alone at home, or when Ethan spent long nights at work, these thoughts came flooding back, disturbing and impossible to ignore. The apartment where they lived was a reflection of their lives, modern, organized, impeccable. Every detail had been carefully chosen, from the linen curtains that decorated the windows to the abstract works of art that Elizabeth insisted on keeping. Ethan had always given her the freedom to decorate the house however she wanted, and she took advantage of that as a way to express her personality. There, in that carefully assembled space, everything seemed to be in place. But, lately, Isabel felt that the aesthetic order around her no longer reflected the order of her thoughts. The nights they spent together were filled with an uncomfortable stillness. They talked, of course, about the day, about the challenges in Ethan's work, about the charitable activities that Isabel organized with other high society wives. But something was missing. The emotional connection, that spark that had defined the early years of their marriage, seemed to have dissipated, transforming what was once passion into a peaceful, functional coexistence. Still, to anyone looking from the outside, nothing seemed to be wrong. The two still smiled at gala dinners, still traveled to the best resorts, still maintained the facade of a perfect life. And in many ways, they still cared deeply for each other. But this affection was turning into something more akin to a practical partnership than the intimacy they both desired, even if, on the surface, it was difficult to admit. Ethan, in turn, tried to rationalize his feelings. For him, everything had always been a matter of logic. Solving problems was his specialty, whether at work or in his personal life. But this time, he felt like he was fighting something more nebulous, something he couldn't fully understand. Hours at the office, once a refuge, now seemed like an escape. A place where he could avoid dealing with the questions that echoed in his mind when he was home. At times, he wondered if this was simply the natural course of things. After so many years together, it was normal for the relationship to lose some of its initial intensity. Maybe it was just a phase, he thought. A phase that could be resolved with a trip, a new project or even more quality time together. But the question remained, he didn't know how to approach this with Isabel. There was an invisible barrier between the two, a barrier he didn't know how to break down. On the other hand, Isabel also felt that something was out of place, but she couldn't name what it was. She had always been a practical woman, used to keeping up appearances and dealing with small, everyday problems efficiently. However, lately, this ability seemed to escape him. Ethan's distant look, the lack of deep conversations, the feeling of stagnation, all of this bothered her deeply, but she didn't know how to bring up these feelings without seeming like she was complaining about something that, in everyone's eyes, was perfect. Despite this, there was a certain comfort in the familiarity they shared. They still shared tender moments, like lazy Sundays where they spent hours on the balcony, just watching the city below. There was a mutual understanding, a silent complicity that only years of coexistence could provide. And for Isabel, that was enough. Or at least that's what she told herself. But deep down, something bigger was stirring, something she still couldn't fully understand. As the weeks passed, the atmosphere between them oscillated between tense tranquility and brief moments of closeness. Isabel, in particular, tried hard to bring back the intimacy she missed so much, organizing dinners, trying to create opportunities for deeper conversations. But somehow, they always ended up returning to the same polished surface they had both learned to maintain. Deep down, both Ethan and Isabel knew something needed to change. What neither of them knew, however, was how deep that chasm would become, and how, soon, their lives would take unexpected turns. The change, invisible until then, was already in motion, and when it arrived, it would not spare anyone. Everything that seemed solid would slowly begin to shatter, revealing truths that they both feared to face. As the months passed, the void between Ethan and Isabel seemed to grow like a silent shadow that little by little took over everything. Despite the attempts of both to re-establish the lost intimacy, there was a distance that neither long conversations nor affectionate gestures could bridge. Something was deeply wrong, but neither of them dared admit it. Isabel, with her ability to keep up appearances, tried to mask her discomfort with an impeccable routine, while Ethan, increasingly absent, took refuge in work and business trips, as if physical distance could contain the emotional distance he felt. On the surface, the marriage was still working. Social commitments, family dinners and weekend trips were always well executed, creating the illusion that everything was in order. But at night, when they were alone, the silence became oppressive. Ethan found himself looking at Isabel, trying to understand what had changed. She was still the same woman he had loved for so long, but somehow, something had disappeared. And, without realizing it, he began to look outside the house for a distraction from this growing anguish. It was on one of these lonely nights that Ethan noticed a small deviation in Isabel's behavior. She was more distracted, her gaze was always distant, her smiles were scarcer. Even in the simplest conversations, it seemed like his mind was far away. He tried to ignore it, trying to believe it was just the stress of everyday life, that it would pass. But the signs intensified. Isabel's frequent departures, her excuses for arriving late, and, most worryingly, the sparkle in her eyes, which he hadn't seen in a while, seemed to have been rekindled. Ethan began to wonder what was really going on. Something inside him warned him, but he hesitated to confront his own fears. Was he exaggerating? Your mind playing tricks on you? Or was there something deeper behind Isabel's evasive behavior? As these thoughts swirled, he began to realize that the long hours at work were no longer enough to distract him. The discomfort inside the house was palpable, and, no matter how much he tried to distance himself from this reality, it continued to surround him, like a specter that was impossible to avoid. Isabel, in turn, was also struggling with her own demons. As much as she tried to maintain normality, something inside her had already changed. The feeling of suffocation that had haunted her for months now seemed unbearable. And it was in this whirlwind of emotions that a new feeling began to infiltrate, a desire to escape, to seek outside what she could no longer find within the marriage. Unlike Ethan, who tried to fight the emptiness, Isabel silently began to fill it in another way. At first, it was something small, almost innocent. An exchange of glances at a social event, a casual comment that made her feel seen again. It wasn't the kind of thing she had consciously planned or sought, but somehow it happened. That person, who at first was just a familiar face among so many others, suddenly began to represent an escape from the monotonous routine that consumed her. Conversations that were previously harmless gradually became intimate. Isabel began to find in this new bond what she had lost with Ethan, excitement, the feeling of newness, of being desired. The meetings, at first, were quick, furtive, wrapped in a cloak of secrecy that only increased the intensity of the attraction. Isabel knew she was crossing a dangerous line, but the adrenaline of experiencing something new and forbidden drove her further and further away from her husband, from the life she knew. The feeling of guilt, although present, was suppressed by the desire, by the illusion that, outside of that life built alongside Ethan, she could rediscover herself, be the woman she once was again. Over time, Isabel's involvement with her lover deepened. The secret messages, the discreet meetings, all of this became a second life, a life she never imagined living, but which, now, seemed to be her only source of satisfaction. And all the while, Ethan, trapped in his own world of work and frustration, continued to ignore the signs that were right in front of his eyes. Until, one night, everything changed. It was a night like any other. Ethan had arrived earlier than usual, carrying a bottle of wine and a silent hope of spending time with Isabel, of perhaps reliving some vestige of the connection they shared. He went up the stairs towards the bedroom, intending to surprise her. However, when he opened the door, Ethan's world collapsed. There, in the space that was once just theirs, he found Isabel. Not alone. The scene before his eyes was like a brutal blow, taking away his breath and ability to reason. Isabel, lying in the bed they shared, was in the arms of another man. A man he didn't know, a stranger in his own home. The shock immobilized him, the silence in the room became deafening, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze in time. Ethan's mind raced, trying to find some explanation that could turn this into a misunderstanding, into something that wasn't what it seemed. But there were no excuses, no denying what was before him. Betrayal, once a distant suspicion, was now a raw, cutting reality, an open wound that bled before his eyes. The impact was devastating. He felt the ground open beneath his feet, and, in that instant, he realized that everything he and Isabel had built over the years, all the love, all the history, had been destroyed in a single moment. The silence in the room seemed to stretch on for an eternity. Ethan, still at the door, could feel his body becoming paralyzed. His mind tried to process what his eyes saw, Isabel, his wife, in the arms of another man. Ethan's blood ran cold. His heart beat frantically, while his breathing became shorter and shorter. That scene seemed to rip out his soul. It was as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet, and he was falling, unable to hold on to anything. For years, he had built his life alongside Isabel. And now, in seconds, everything was falling apart. Elizabeth noticed his presence. A shock took over his face, his eyes wide with fright as he met Ethan's gaze, standing at the door. For a moment, no one moved. The lover, confused, quickly moved away from the bed, not knowing what to do. Isabel tried to speak, but the words seemed to stick in her throat. The weight of that moment was crushing. "Ethan," she finally managed to whisper, her voice weak, barely audible. Ethan didn't respond. His mind was racing, fighting a torrent of emotions rushing through him. Anger, sadness, disappointment, everything was mixed together in an internal chaos that left him speechless. He looked at Isabel, at the man next to her, and suddenly everything he believed about his marriage, his life, seemed like one big theater, a lie that had gone on longer than it should have. The betrayal was there, naked and raw, before his eyes. The pain was unbearable, a pain he had never imagined feeling. Ethan tried to control his breathing, fighting the urge to scream, to explode. But he knew that screaming wouldn't change anything. The pieces were already broken, and he now faced the shattered pieces of his life. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, but filled with a coldness that he himself didn't recognize. "How could you do that?" Isabel, still sitting on the bed, covered her body with the sheet, not knowing how to respond. The man beside him had already gotten up, desperately looking for his clothes, not daring to look at Ethan. He knew he needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. I don't know what to say, Ethan," Isabel stammered, visibly upset, but still unable to face the gravity of what she had done. "Don't know what to say." Ethan repeated, his voice louder now, full of bitterness. "You destroyed everything. Everything we built together. And you don't know what to say." Isabel remained silent. The lover, hastily dressing, muttered something inaudible and tried to leave without making a sound. Ethan didn't even look at him. The man didn't matter. It was Isabel who mattered, the woman with whom he had shared his life, his dreams, his frustrations. The woman who, now, had betrayed him in the most cruel way. When the lover finally left, leaving the bedroom door ajar, silence once again dominated the room. Ethan and Isabel stood there, on opposite sides of the room, not knowing how to restart a conversation that seemed impossible to start. The weight of that moment was suffocating, and the words Isabel finally spoke sounded like blades cutting through the air. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, tears starting to stream down her face. "Feel?" Ethan laughed, but it was a bitter, joyless laugh. "Are you sorry? How can you say that? That doesn't erase what you did, Isabel. This doesn't erase anything." She knew that. She knew there was no excuse, that there were no words that could repair the damage she had caused. But at that moment, she still didn't understand the depth of her actions. The real impact of what she had done had not reached its full extent. Isabel had lived that second life with a mixture of excitement and guilt, but she had never imagined that everything would come to a head in this way, destroying so much, so quickly. Ethan turned to the window, his gaze lost on the horizon. The pain was physical, as if someone was ripping out his heart with their own hands. He always thought that if something like this happened, he would be able to handle it. But now that he was here, face to face with reality, he didn't know what to do. Everything seemed meaningless. "Why?" he asked, still not turning to her. "Why, Isabel? I never imagined." She got up from the bed, slowly walking towards him. Her hands were shaking, and the tears were falling freely now. I don't know, Ethan. I got lost. We got lost." He turned to her finally, his face distorted with pain. "Us? No. You got lost, Isabel. I was here. All the time. I always have been." Isabel reached out her hand, trying to touch Ethan's arm, but he backed away, as if her simple touch was an affront. She sighed, the weight of guilt finally crushing her. He knew he couldn't repair what he had done. There was no going back. "You don't understand," she began, her voice cracking with emotion. "There was a moment when I felt so, suffocated. Lost inside myself. I tried to find something outside, something that made me feel alive again. But that doesn't justify what I did. I know that. I just wanted to let you know that this isn't about you. It was never about you." Ethan stared at her with a mixture of disbelief and pain. "It doesn't have to do with me," he repeated, almost laughing again. "How can it not have to do with me? You destroyed what we had. And now you tell me this has nothing to do with me?" He ran his hands over his face, trying to organize his thoughts. But everything was a mess. His mind was spinning, and the only thing he could feel was the emptiness that now occupied the place where love once was. And then, suddenly, a new wave of emotion hit him. It wasn't just about the betrayal. There was something more. A truth that was there, right in front of him, but that he still couldn't fully understand. Something about the way Isabel avoided looking into his eyes, as if there were more things unsaid, more secrets hidden in the shadows. "Is there anything else you haven't told me?" he asked, his voice low, almost as if he didn't want to know the answer. But deep down, I knew there was something more. Something she was hiding. And now, after everything that had happened, he needed to know. Isabel hesitated. She looked at the floor, unable to meet Ethan's gaze. He moved a little closer, his heart racing. "Isabel," he insisted, "what else are you hiding from me?" The silence that followed was agonizing. Isabel bit her lip, her hands shaking as she tried to find the right words. There was something she hadn't told him. Something that consumed her inside, but that she had not been able to reveal until then. Ethan knew. He could see in her eyes that there was a secret, something bigger than betrayal. Something that could change everything. And in that instant, he was determined to find out what it was. Isabel's breathing quickened. She looked at Ethan one last time, as if trying to gauge the impact of what she was about to say. But there was no turning back. The secret she had kept for so long was about to be revealed, and there was no holding it in anymore. He left me," Isabel whispered, the words almost dying on her lips. "The man I was with. He left me, as soon as he knew I would have nothing left. No money, no security. He was with me for what he thought I could offer him. But the moment I knew that you would take everything from me, he was gone." Ethan was silent, absorbing her words. He felt a mixture of anger, relief, and bitter satisfaction upon hearing that. Isabel, who had betrayed everything they had, was now alone. Betrayed by her own lover. The weight of Isabel's words hung in the air, thick, almost palpable. Ethan felt the world spinning around him, but he remained motionless, fixed to the ground as if an invisible anchor was keeping him upright. The revelation that her lover had abandoned Isabel, in the same way that she had betrayed him, brought a strange sense of justice. But instead of feeling vindicated, Ethan was filled with an even greater emptiness. That revelation should have brought him satisfaction, but, somehow, it only made reality more bitter. Isabel was there, destroyed by her own betrayal, alone amid the rubble of a life that she herself had torn apart. The lover, who she thought was her escape, her relief, had disappeared as soon as she realized there was no more wealth to share, no promising future with her. And Ethan, who now knew the whole truth, felt his heart sinking at the dilemma that lay before him. She had been wrong. She had broken the trust that had once been the foundation of their marriage, and now it was shattered, with nothing but regret and shame. Ethan felt a pulsing anger inside him, but also a deep sadness at seeing what Isabel had become. Seeing her there, vulnerable, finally willing to admit her weakness, he wondered how someone he loved so much had lost himself so deeply. And yet, while the pain of betrayal still burned inside him, there was a voice that asked him, "What now? What to do with all this?" Ethan knew that the decision he would make at that moment would forever change the course of their lives. The separation seemed inevitable, but there was something more at stake. Something that went beyond the obvious. A moral question was unfolding within him, a conflict between the desire for justice and the shadow of his own humanity. "So he left you," Ethan said, his voice filled with a bitterness he could barely contain. "You gave everything we had, to be left with nothing." Isabel, with her eyes swollen and her voice choked, shook her head, unable to respond immediately. She knew there were no more excuses. He knew the truth was there, naked and raw, in front of them. And now, there was nothing left to hide. I was wrong," she finally said, her voice shaking. "I thought that, by running away, I would find a way out. I thought there was something else out there, something that could save me from what I was feeling. But all I did was destroy. Destroy you. Destroy us." Ethan took a deep breath, trying to control the whirlwind of emotions that consumed him. What was left now was a decision he never imagined he would have to make. The betrayal was an open wound, but at the same time, there, in front of him, was a broken woman, someone who, no matter how much she had hurt him, was still part of his life, part of who he had been. He turned and walked to the window, looking out at the night. The city lights flickered in the distance, oblivious to the drama unfolding in that room. Life continued outside, without caring about the choices he needed to make. "And what did you expect?" he asked, still facing away from her. "That I would just forgive? Who ignored what you did? To overlook everything as if it were a minor flaw?" Isabel did not respond immediately. The silent tears continued to stream down her face, and she knew that anything she said now wouldn't make a difference. Reality was relentless, and she had been the architect of her own destruction. "I don't expect anything," he said finally, his voice barely audible. I know I hurt you in a way that may be impossible to fix. I just wanted you to know that, despite everything, I loved you. I love you. Ethan closed his eyes, trying to make sense of that late confession. Her words felt empty now, echoing in a space that could no longer be filled. But still, something inside him wavered. What would he do with that love she claimed to still feel? He slowly turned around, facing her once more. Isabel was curled up on the sofa, her eyes red and her body bent, as if waiting for an imminent trial. And in a way, that's what she deserved, final judgment on her actions. The moral dilemma deepened within Ethan. He could follow two very different paths, opt for emotional revenge, for the definitive cut that would leave her alone and ruined, or try to rescue something from what had once been a shared life. You betrayed me, he said, his voice firmer. And it destroyed what we had. That doesn't change. It will never change. Isabel looked at him, her face soaked with tears, without hope of redemption. I knew I deserved that weight. He knew that no matter how much he tried to explain, no matter how much he begged, he could never fix what he had done. I know, she murmured, her voice almost trailing off. Ethan walked towards the door, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the handle. He was about to leave. He knew that, when he walked through that door, he would be abandoning Isabel once and for all, leaving behind everything they had built. And maybe that's what he should do. It was what many would do, what would be expected. Leave her alone, paying the price for her choices. But something stopped him from taking that last step. He paused for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision on his shoulders. And then, as if a small light turned on in the darkness, he spoke, without turning to Isabel. I don't know if I can forgive what you did, he said, his voice lower now, almost a whisper. But, perhaps, there is still something to be saved. I don't know how, I don't know if there is enough strength in us to overcome this. But maybe, Isabel lifted her head, her eyes searching Ethan's, trying to understand what he was offering. Hope, so fragile, began to emerge, even though she knew the road ahead would be painful. Are you saying that? Ethan released the handle, sighing deeply. He turned slowly, facing Isabel once again, seeing the woman he once loved, and who now seemed so far away, but at the same time so close. I don't know what I'm saying, he admitted, his eyes filled with a confusion that reflected his internal state. But I know I don't want it to end like this. Not now. Not like this. Isabel, with her heart racing, slowly got up from the sofa, feeling that little ray of light, that chance she never thought she would have, was there, within reach of her hands. Ethan backed away from the door, feeling the weight of the decision he had just made. He knew it wouldn't be easy, that the path to any kind of reconciliation was covered in thorns. However, there was something that compelled him not to close that door for good. When he looked into Isabel's eyes, he saw more than regret. He saw despair, he saw the bankruptcy of a woman who had lost everything, and not just materially. Isabel was adrift, and as much as the pain of betrayal still burned in his chest, he knew he couldn't turn his back and leave her like this, destroyed. Without a word, Ethan sat back down, not looking directly at her. Isabel, surprised, remained motionless for a few moments. What he was offering wasn't forgiveness, she knew that. It wasn't a promise that things would go back to the way they were before, but it was an opening, a chance. And she, with tears still rolling down her face, realized that opportunity was the only one she would have to try to fix something, even if it was little. She took a small step forward, but Ethan's voice stopped her before she could speak. That doesn't mean I trust you again, he began, his voice hoarse, filled with a mix of resentment and exhaustion. This does not mean that everything will be the same as before. I don't know if I can forgive you. But I'm willing to try to understand how we got here. Isabel felt a twinge of hope. She didn't know if he could do it, if they could do it. But just the fact that he didn't abandon her right away was something. It was more than she deserved, and she knew it. She nodded slowly, feeling the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. The days that followed were filled with uncomfortable silence. Ethan and Isabel lived under the same roof, but as strangers. There was no more intimacy, no more comfort in each other's presence. But there was something new, the truth, painful and raw, but there. For the first time in a long time, they were being honest. Each interaction was filled with tension, with insecurity, as if any false step could destroy the fragile balance they were trying to build. Isabel tried to win Ethan back the only way she knew how, by being transparent. She opened up in a way she never had before. She talked about the insecurities she carried, the emptiness she felt, the thoughtless decisions that led her to that point. They were not justifications, but confessions. And slowly, Ethan began to listen, without interrupting, without immediately judging. He was still hurt, still felt the anger bubbling up at unexpected moments, but he was also beginning to understand that the betrayal was just a symptom of something much deeper that had been lost between them long ago. One night, Ethan broke the silence that reigned in the house. Sitting at the table, with his gaze fixed on a glass of water, he finally asked something that had been tormenting him since the beginning. "If he hadn't left you, would you stay with me?" Isabel took a deep breath, feeling the weight of that question. She knew the right answer could mean a lot to Ethan, but she also knew he deserved the truth, no matter how painful it was. "I don't know," she replied, truthfully. "I was so lost, Ethan. I thought running away would make everything easier. But the truth is, none of that would have solved what was wrong inside me." Ethan looked at her, his gaze filled with a mixture of pain and understanding. This was the answer he feared, but also expected. In a way, her honesty was a relief. He no longer wanted to live with lies, no matter how cruel the truths were. Now, everything was on the table. From there, it was a matter of deciding how to move forward. In the months that followed, Ethan made a decision that surprised even himself. He decided to take a step back. He temporarily moved away from Isabel. He rented a small apartment, where he could be alone, thinking. He needed time and distance to process everything, to understand if what was left between them still had something worth fighting for. Isabel, in turn, embarked on a personal journey. He started attending therapy, something he had always avoided. There, she began to confront the demons that had haunted her for a long time. Therapy brought to light her deepest insecurities, her misguided motivations, and, little by little, she began to rebuild her self-esteem. She knew that recovering Ethan would be a long and uncertain process, but, for the first time in a long time, she was willing to face whatever was necessary, without looking for easy escapes. Over time, Ethan and Isabel began to meet, initially in short, formal conversations, but which gradually became more in-depth. Ethan was still hurt, but something about Isabel had changed. She was no longer the woman who had lost herself in illusions. And in a way, he wasn't the same man she had betrayed either. Time brought clarity, and with that clarity came a new realization: they could never go back to being the couple they once were. The pain of betrayal had changed everything, but that didn't mean they couldn't be something new, something different. On a rainy afternoon, months after their temporary separation, Ethan finally made a decision. He met her in a cafe, the place they used to go when they were at the beginning of their relationship, and, after a long conversation, he said what Isabel feared and, at the same time, expected. "I don't know if we can still be what we were," he began, his eyes fixed on hers. "But I'm willing to try to be something new." Isabel nodded, speechless. Tears of relief ran down her face. "It wasn't the perfect ending I imagined, but it was a new chance. And this time, she wasn't going to waste it." Now that we've reached the end of this story, what did you think? Leave your comment and share your opinion. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more stories like this. Always remember, here, we do not support betrayal. The stories show how decisions can destroy lives and how we should always value honesty and respect in relationships. Until next time.